Okay, so when we have Alice, and she does business with the MSP has to actually understand who she is. So we conduct some sort of know your customer on her. And then also when Alice gives her money, we can tell them from her parents, so we'll put dollars in there. They have to understand that that's legitimate. It hasn't touched terrorists or blacklists or things like that. Now, all of this knowledge is transferred into the MSP, and they're supposed to maintain it. And then when Bob, the regulator, comes in, what Bob does is Bob says, well, did you do your job? And there's a lot to that question. And in addition, if Alice has something questionable, the MSP actually has to tell Bob about it. It's called a SAR, Suspicious Activities Report. Okay? This is how, very primitively, modern compliance works. Now, there's a huge amount of problems because Alice didn't just have that money grow out of a hat. There's a transitive chain, many steps removed. And, if you've ever heard of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, you're probably 6 steps removed from Pablo Escobar, all of you, myself included. So at the end of the day, some of this value that Alice has probably was involved at some point somewhere in something illicit. And the challenge is that the law is very draconian. There's no de minimis clause usually for money laundering and so forth. And so this is why MSP failures for compliance happen all the time. Billions of dollars of fines occur. It's why drug lords are able to use the conventional banking system. Second, if you really think about the philosophy of this type of a system, it's an adversarial system. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that the bank is serving a dual role. It's serving the financial needs of Alice, but it's also acting as a regulator. So if Alice has a misconduct, the bank says, oh, well, I have to spy on my own customer and tell the government that my own customer is doing something wrong. You never want to create a duality of relationships here. So as a company, we've been exploring how do we change this model fundamentally? How do we go to a new model? So the new model would be something like this. Instead of all that compliance information being collected and owned by the MSP, let's create kind of a bucket. We'll call it a data warehouse. And what Alice is going to do is she's going to send her data there. And she's going to create some sort of portfolio with that warehouse. How much he shares that portfolio, completely up to her. And this is unaudited, unverified information. Then you can have auditors, and auditors can live anywhere. You can be one. And those auditors are going to, in some way, verify and validate the information. And so you see, well, how do we know the auditor is credible? Well, that's up to the system you live in. So maybe the U.S. government says they're good. Maybe they work for the U.S. government. Maybe they work for Estonia. Maybe they work for Hong Kong. Maybe they're PwC. This is an abstract system. So then, once you have this, it lives encrypted here. It's ultimately still owned by Alice. And then when Alice wants to do business with an MSP, Alice will just simply send a transaction to it. And this is called contingent settlement. Okay. And what happens? Does it clear? No. It says it's pending. And what the MSP is going to do is say, where does Alice live? Where does the data live? Where do I live? Maybe this is Hong Kong, maybe that's Nigeria, maybe that's the United States. Okay. Then go to the regulator and say, give me the library of questions I need to ask for America, for Nigeria, and for Hong Kong. And what I'm going to do is just query the system with zero knowledge queries. So basically I'm asking yes-no questions. Pay your taxes, yes, no, etc., etc. But I'm not actually learning a lot about Alice. I'm just learning the minimum viable amount of information I need to either reject the transaction or accept the transaction. And I'm doing this on a per transaction basis. Now here's the magic of this system. It's automated, and the regulator is in total control of the questions that are asked. And it has an audit trail, it's time-stamped. So basically you can go through every scenario. You can say, well, what if the auditor is not credible? Then we reject the transaction. What if there's not enough data in the warehouse? Then we reject the transaction. What if the jurisdiction is blacklisted? Then we reject the transaction. This entity doesn't need to know that. It can just run the questions, every single query. And what does it mean? It means it never possesses your data. It doesn't belong to them, it belongs to you. You're in charge of that. And these can be businesses, and every time a query comes, they make a small microtransaction from it. So they actually make money from running this. So you've now broken an old system to a new system, you've given more power to the regulator, and you've removed the chief compliance officer. If any of you are in that role, I've just fired you. I'm sorry. So this is an abstraction. Life is more complicated, reality is more complicated, but the point is that we as a company can study this in as much depth and detail as possible, and then what we can do is dream of a system like this. And then we can implement systems like this in places like Uganda and Angola and throughout the developing world, especially for Pan-African cross-border settlement. Because at the end of the day, they're not doing any of these. They're in cash economy, or if there are transfers, it's done between friends, or they have alternative systems, and those systems live outside of compliance. So what we do as a company is we imagine how to build things like this, and then we imagine how to work with regulators in small jurisdictions like Uganda, Rwanda, Angola, and other places to implement these systems, and then eventually have these systems roll out to consumers. And then our hope is if they're successful, we've built a better world, because you're in charge of your identity. You can reuse this for more than just one MSD. The regulator has a lot more power and control. They can also share their question lists with each other, so now they can have more productive cross-regulatory talks. And we've just created lots of jobs for auditors, local, high-paying, cool jobs, and we've got rid of these expensive, horrible chief compliance officer jobs. So sorry.
The audience here, but that's okay. But you know, this is fascinating. So if I can drill down a little bit more. So as you may know, I do quite a bit in the RegTech space. So what you've kind of described is a KYC utility, in a sense. But what's being proposed, and even here in Hong Kong right now, is a centralized KYC utility.
Right.
Which I presume your data warehouse is not centralized.
Well, that's the thing. So you can build that into these situations. So it's an abstract model. So I can just have Hong Kong own the data warehouse. And you say the only data warehouse that's legitimate to query is the Hong Kong Fair. But then, you know, once you have a conversation with the auditor or the regulator, they'll probably say, well, maybe we'll also accept Beijing. Or, you know, maybe we'll also accept Shanghai. Because then they'll say, well, no, maybe we also accept this partner or something like that. And it gives you something to talk around. So you can start with one and go to many, but it still holds the abstraction.
Right, I see. But so linked to that also is the concept of regulatory nodes. So to the extent, and I hear you're doing a lot of PPP kind of transactions, right? So a lot of regulators seem to be leaning and getting more comfortable with permissioned blockchain, but in particular, they want a regulatory node. Do you have thoughts on that?
So contingent settlement is an abstract concept, and basically the idea is that the settlement doesn't occur until certain predicates are met. Now those predicates can be that both parties have signed a contract. Donations are a good example of this. You know, let's say Bob donates $500,000 to Alice's charity under the understanding that the money is going to be used for X, Y, and Z. It would be nice to embed in that transaction that exact legal understanding, hash it, sign it, and then have Alice do the exact same thing before the settlement occurs, so there's some sort of legal swine trail. Now that's a very primitive structure, but you can compose that up to any amount of things, like saying all transactions will only settle if the government was also a counterparty of that. And then the government can then require certain things to be present in the structure of the transaction or the metadata of the transaction that only the government can see, for example. And then if it's missing, the transaction can't settle. So these types of systems can be constructed with smart contracts and are fully automated. So it means that you can put actually pretty draconian regulations into a system that's open, but still you can automate these in a way that it doesn't actually impact the consumer. My father is a doctor. One of the biggest problems in the American medical system are unfunded mandates. So the federal government all the time after something happens will say, oh, we should pass a regulation or a law and say, oh, well, you need to now start doing X, Y, and Z. But they don't actually provide funding behind that. So they increase the cost structure of compliance without increasing the revenue of the model. So you reduce the margins and usually gets carried to the consumer. A lot of cases here, you can add more regulation arbitrarily and you pay the fee once when you're building the system, and then it kind of runs itself.
Okay, fascinating. And I'm sure it'll raise a lot of other questions, but I wanted to stay a little bit more abstract. So part of a lot of your work really relies on cryptography. But one of the things that people talk about is quantum computers. So to what extent are you worried about that in terms of a time horizon, and to what extent perhaps you're building to kind of be quantum, computer proof?
We have some cryptographers in the audience too. This is always a fun question. See, every field has a boogeyman in some respect. And, right